Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Our guests are Kim Lyons from the PA Capital Star, Carter Walker from Votebeat, and Katie Meyer from Spotlight PA. Katie, we'll start with you. A Democrat, Eugene DePasquale, won a 5-way primary for Attorney General. What kind of campaign did he run?
Well, as you said, it was a really tight primary. And one of the things that DePasquale, I think, benefited from was that he was the only candidate in that field who was not from southeastern Pennsylvania. The other candidates really competed, A, for funding, and B, just for voter recognition in the rest of the state. And so you saw that in the returns. DePasquale won the majority of the western part of the state. The other thing you could see in that is that he was the only person who had previously run and won statewide. He's the former Auditor General. Before that, he was a state representative. And so you really saw that in the returns. I think those are the two really big factors that you saw him bring to the table. But I will say, you asked about how he ran the campaign. Overall, his fundraising, he did not have the most money. He actually ended with just barely the least on hand. There were some really well-funded candidates from the Southeast. So, I think it's absolutely a testament to statewide name recognition above all else.
Kim, what do you think? How did DePasquale separate himself from this field of other candidates?
Yeah, I think Katie's absolutely right. He had the name recognition. He had a strong base of support in Western Pennsylvania. And I think, it was difficult for anyone other than him to get statewide traction because, the party didn't endorse anyone officially, the state party. Whereas the Republican winner of the Republican primary, Dave Sunday, had the party endorsement. And so I think it became harder for the candidates who largely agreed on the issues to sort of differentiate themselves from each other. They were all, fairly in agreement on most issues. So it was sort of tough for them to stand out. And I think Katie's right. DePasquale had the name recognition and had held statewide office before. So I think that's what helped him in the end.
So, ladies, that was important that DePasquale held these other offices before, and that would be namely Auditor General and Representative. That helped him. Now, keeping in mind that he ran for Congress before and he lost.
He did, yeah. I mean, and that's, I think, also a testament to that district. He was running against Scott Perry in 10th Congressional Central PA. It was a district that at the time was seen as having gotten more friendly to Democrats. It had just been redistricted. And so it was an open question about how well Democrats could do there. And since he ran and lost in that district, the consensus has been Republicans can still hold that. Maybe that'll change going forward between now and the next time we get redistricted. But, that I think is more about the district than anything else.
Now, name recognition aside, what kind of issues were put out there by, any of these candidates in addition to DePasquale?
There were a few that all the candidates talked about repeatedly, and I'm sure, Kim Carter can add in more, but one of the big ones was abortion. Just uniformly, the Democratic candidates, and we can talk about the Republicans too, but the Democratic candidates in that crowded primary all said that they wanted to protect the right to an abortion, access to abortion in Pennsylvania. That's been a big thing for voters. Guns were another one, guns and crime in general. I think the Democrats really focused on gun control, getting illegal guns off the streets in various ways. And there were other issues as well. But I would say that you saw a lot of uniformity around the candidates, and they didn't really in debates and things, they didn't go after each other in the way that even the Republicans did.
So, Kim, what do you think? Are issues such as abortion and gun control appropriate for an Auditor General race?
I think so. I think it helps to show that you are in keeping with the party's, sort of overall thoughts, and voters in the Democratic Party these are issues they're very much thinking about, even if the Auditor General might not directly, the Attorney General might not directly deal with cases specifically. It's hard to say, but there's been a lot of things have come out of attorney generals across the country recently. That they've sort of taken proactive stances on a lot of issues. So that's something that is very likely to continue to happen. So I think it's good for them to establish where they stand so voters feel confident. And I think, the sort of joke, I think, in Harrisburg is that, Attorney General AG stands for almost governor. It's one of those races that, it sort of seems a stepping stone. Obviously, our current governor was in that role previously. So I think it's also running for the next election, right? To show where you stand on these issues that potentially, if down the road you are elected to a higher office, you've already established kind of your bona fides as a true blue Democrat. I will say also there was some, as Katie mentioned, there wasn't a lot of like even just bickering at debates. They very much were cordial and agreed. I think it got a little bit negative near the end. Solomon ran an ad against DePasquale, sort of, pivoted up, positioning themselves as the kind of the two candidates really competing. And they also there was a lot of kind of statements against, sort of the Donald Trump MAGA wing of the Republican Party, that was very much part of the campaigns. It's something that all of the candidates were clear that they wanted to, take on or very much were cognizant of as being part of their role as Attorney General.
Let's take a look at the Republican side of the ticket in Tuesday's primary for Attorney General. And there were only two candidates in that primary. Dave Sunday prevailed. And how did he wage a successful campaign? Katie?
So this one was very different from the Democratic side, just in that a two-person race and there was a party endorsement. So Sunday had the backing of the state GOP, and you can see that in the returns that we got. He won easily. I think we alluded to this before. It was a slightly more contentious race than the Democratic side had been. One of the things that Craig Williams had brought up, and Williams, by the way, is a state representative from southeastern Pennsylvania, so one of the few Republicans still holding a seat in the collar counties. Sunday is currently the York County District Attorney. But anyway, Sunday years ago was a registered Democrat, and that was something that Williams brought up repeatedly during debates. Williams really cast himself as a more conservative, or at least a more tough on crime candidate. But that was really the goal of both of these candidates. It was a tough on crime race in the GOP. Williams had been a chief figure in the effort among House Republicans to impeach Larry Krasner, and also to kind of supersede some of his authority. The Philadelphia DA, Larry Krasner, progressive and also sort of a favorite, I would say, punching bag of Republicans in Pennsylvania on issues, involving crime. And Sunday, similarly, really was pointing to his record of trying to reduce crime in York County and in the city of York. And so, both of them also, I should say, have said that they don't think that Pennsylvania's constitution protects the right to an abortion. So that's something significant. The attorney general would take part in lawsuits over that if the state gets sued. A number of stances to think about there.
Kim, what stood out to you about Dave Sunday's victory for the Republican nomination for Attorney General?
I think one of the things that Craig Williams sort of homed in on early was, as district attorney in York County, that's been an area that's had it's a significant, uptick in crime. It's been a big, serious problem in that county. And there was something that I think Williams sort of unsuccessfully poked out a little bit, that maybe, Sunday was able to sort of deflect and say, look, I've come in and I've cleaned things up. I've changed things for the better. I think that was one area where the tough on crime stance is definitely one that these candidates both tried to sort of position themselves. I think also, you mentioned, Katie mentioned the Larry Krasner angle, that it's one of those issues that's, I think, candidates statewide don't really have a good perception of. In this end of the state where I am in Western Pennsylvania, Larry Krasner is almost a non-issue. It's not something that resonates statewide with voters. It's something that's very important in the Southeast, very important in the Philly area. But I think, Williams kind of dug in on that issue, maybe in that, I don't know, you could say for sure, but I don't think that helped him necessarily with voters in Western PA. And I think, ultimately, I think that's something that, statewide candidates have to think about. It's a big state. Someone who's a very big deal in Western PA may be barely, an issue for voters in the other part of the states, and vice versa. So I think that may be one area where, Williams kind of dug in a little bit more than probably was necessary. And I don't know if it really helped him in the end.
Katie or Kim, can you give me an example from recent history when the Attorney General's actions really captured the public's attention?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of examples. The biggest one that I always go back to is in 2018, Josh Shapiro, who is now the governor, then was Attorney General, released a grand jury report on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. That was enormous news. It named a bunch of priests who had been accused of sexual abuse. Many were dead, some were not. Some had complicit in covering it up, that kind of thing. So that was huge. That was big news. And that's something that an attorney general can do, is initiate these grand jury reports. Actually, Shapiro's predecessor, Kathleen Kane, had initiated that report. Another thing is just when Pennsylvania gets sued, the attorney general is the person who's in charge of defending the state and of kind of protecting, or saying that the state's laws were correct and good. And so you saw that, for instance, in the 2020 election when our election results were being contested in various ways. And I think that's something that becomes really important. Kim mentioned that the attorney general is a prominent position, almost governor. When something like that happens, the attorney general is in a role of great prominence. And so you saw that again with Shapiro. It gave him sort of a national presence around the 2020 election.
We're going to talk more about the races in Tuesday's primary, but for now I want to get Carter Walker involved. He's from Votebeat. Carter, first tell us take a minute rather, to tell us what Votebeat is all about.
Yeah, well, we really focus on the mechanics of how our elections work. Election workers, how poll workers do their jobs, the rules that the legislatures come up for how we manage our elections in the states that we're in. And here in Pennsylvania, we partner with Katie and Spotlight PA in doing that work.
And tell us about then, were there any problems reported in Tuesday's primary?
No, I think much to many election administrators' credit, and they're happy about it. And the Department of State, we didn't see any major issues like we saw in Luzerne in 2022 with them running out of ballot paper, or Northampton last year with them, not testing their machines properly. Didn't see any of that this year, which is really, I think, having election administrators breathe a sigh of relief this year, because they don't want the added attention that comes with that. Anytime we have any of these, minor human errors that come up in Pennsylvania, it seems to get some outsized attention, with congressional hearings or investigations, and it just brings unwanted attention to these folks who like to just be behind the scenes and make sure everything's running smoothly. They like to stay out of the headlines, and so I think from their perspective, Tuesday was definitely a good day for them. They don't want any more attention than necessary in a presidential year.
I know Votebeat likes to keep an eye on election directors, and just tell us, what is an election director responsibilities-wise? What do they have to do? Yeah,
so election director is kind of like a catch-all term for the person in your county who really is in charge of running the logistics of the election. Sometimes they're called the register, they're the chief clerk or manager, but they are the person that coordinates getting your polling locations set up, all the machines, the workers that need to be there to make the thing actually run. They're designing your ballot, they're mailing your ballot out to you and taking it back in, and then counting it, once it gets back to them. So they are the people who, without them, we wouldn't be able to vote for these folks that we're electing to office. They're behind the scenes making it all happen.
Carter, in our last election, some election workers reported being harassed. So there's been turnover as a result. And what kind of turnover has there been, and have the vacancies been filled? Do we have enough people to manage these elections? Yeah, well, I think as far as I know, we are fully staffed. I'm not sure of any county offices that don't have an election director, at least in an interim capacity right now. But like you said, we definitely have had a lot of turnover in the past couple of years. It's people have gotten more experience since my reporting, but a couple of months ago I reported we were down a few hundred years of experience collectively across the state, which is a big concern, because a lot of the well-oiled machine type nature that you want to see from these offices comes from the experience of the person in charge. And as Secretary Schmidt has pointed out before, it's been a concern for him, the turnover. But the Department of State and counties have been taking measures to try and address that. Some counties that I talked to, they've brought in past election directors to kind of act as a mentor to the new election directors and answer their questions. The Department of State has kind of adopted that model as well. They set up a training program that's being run by a former election director, and that program is, walking them through all the basics, all the new directors walking them through the basics of, okay, here's how you print your poll book and get your mail ballots out and do your logic and accuracy, your voting machine testing. And you got to learn how to deal with voters, too, and I imagine the training has changed to reflect that. Sometimes an election worker might feel they have to de-escalate something like they're a police officer. Yeah, the metaphor they always use when they talk to me is that they're like a customer service department for their voters. Being personal is a very big aspect and asset to this job. You got to know how to deal with people. Let's go back to the races for Congress, namely the 10th Congressional District. And Kim, I'd like you to lead the way on the six-way primary that Janelle Stelson won. So what kind of a campaign did she have?
So I think Janelle Stelson probably benefited from the recognition that she has as a former anchor for WGAL-TV in the area. So I think that really that made her candidacy kind of the front runner, even though there weren't really any official polls done publicly. She was sort of seen as the most high profile of the candidates. There was Mike O'Brien, who was a retired military officer. There was Shameen Daniels, a Harrisburg City Council person who has run against incumbent Scott Perry before. Rick Koppel, a retired Army officer. John Broadhurst, a businessman. And Blake Lynch, who used to be with WITF-FM. So they were all fairly well known in their respective communities, but I don't know that it's tough. It's tough in a six-way race to make yourself stand out from the crowd, because I think, again, this was a situation where they agreed on many of the issues. One of the issues that did come up was residency. I think that's something we're going to see in Pennsylvania races from now on, that, questioning if you live in the district, how long have you lived in the district? Those were questions that were sort of raised about Stelson and O'Brien. And also that Stelson had, previously been a registered Republican, and she said, she changed her registration. She'd been a Republican because their parents were, and sort of inherited that somewhat. But she was sort of questioned about that as well. But I think overall she had the recognition. She was doing a lot, going out and knocking on doors quite a lot near the end of the campaign. And I think it's going to be interesting because Scott Perry is an incumbent, and as we mentioned before, Eugene T. Pasquale ran against him unsuccessfully previously. He's always been seen sort of as a strong incumbent, but lately that has not necessarily been the perception, right? That I think one of the national ratings outlet that sort of looks at different districts, congressional districts, and sort of ranks them based on how likely they are to go for one party or the other. This used to be a strong, likely Republican district, right? And only recently it's been sort of changed to leans Republican, which means, there might be some wiggle room there. I think if there's any time that a Democrat might have an opportunity in PA10, it might be this election. I think, Perry is, I think, still heavily favored, but I think Janelle Stelson ran a campaign where she made herself very visible, and all of the candidates, we spoke with them, and at the debates that they did as well, they all said if they were not the ultimate nominee for the Democratic Party, would they support their fellow Democrat? And they all said yes, because we must defeat Scott Perry. So they were very united in that sense. And I was actually kind of surprised they all hung in there until the primary. Sometimes when you have a big field of candidates, they sort of, resources become thin, and, campaigns are tough to run as someone who doesn't have a ton of resources. So I think it's to their credit, they all sort of hung in there. They all agreed that they were very much opposed to having Scott Perry continue in that seat. So I think even though there were six candidates, they were all, there was all very similar priorities expressed by them. And I think it shows that Democrats in PA10, maybe they're more united than a six-way race would make you think. But I think it's going to be a really interesting race to watch. I know all the headlines right now are around Casey McCormick, but I really think PA10 is going to be kind of the sleeper hit of this campaign season, if we can think of it that way.
Kim, talk some more about the importance of the relationship Janelle Stelson formed with TV news viewers. After all, she was on the air for several decades.
Yeah, for quite a long time. And she kind of spoke of that as an advantage, that, people know me, they recognize me, they trust me. I've come into their homes on television for many years. And I think she really wisely leaned into that. She didn't try and, put it as something in her past that she wasn't going to speak about, or like a previous, career that now she's on a different path. I think she really saw that as an asset. And I think ultimately it became an asset because she had the highest recognition of anyone in a Democrat in that primary. And I think she kind of leaned into it. She made, kept that sort of persona of being someone that you trust, and someone that, is knows what people in the district care about. And so, I think it's going to be, in the general, we'll see how much she leans into that, or she, sort of takes a different tack. I think it would be smart for her to, continue in that vein, because it seemed like it worked well for her so far. So I do think she leaned into it. This, I've come into your living rooms, for many years, and I know what people in this district care about. And so I think she very wisely leaned into it and made it kind of a part of her campaign. I think she'll probably continue it moving forward in the general.
Now, Kim, just for now, let's put aside Janelle Stelson's vast experience on TV news and consider any issues she may have articulated during the campaign. Did you pick up on any?
Yeah, I mean, I think she came right out of the gate saying, abortion access was going to be a very big issue that she was concerned about. She was very concerned about, basically the sort of MAGA Republican, again, that has, become really problematic for a lot of registered Republicans and a lot of, frankly, for Democratic candidates that, they see kind of Scott Perry in that group, someone who's very, aligned with former President Trump, who is the presumptive GOP nominee for president. I think abortion access is going to be a big issue because it's one that Perry is very much on the opposite end of the conversation as far as his stance on abortion rights. And I think that's one that it's been a big loser for Republicans, quite frankly, to run on an anti-abortion platform in post-Roe. In every election we've seen where, abortion has been implicitly or explicitly on the ballot, Democrats have been successful. We can look at, the November 2023 election in our own state where we elected a new Supreme Court justice. That was very much sort of a referendum on abortion, even though it wasn't specifically on the ballot, even though it wasn't going to, voting against McCaffrey or voting Carolyn Carlucci on that seat would not have tipped the balance of the court. But I think, abortion advocates are realizing they need to think several steps ahead and, think into the future about having a majority, Democratic majority on the state Supreme Court for abortion advocates is very important to protect the specific cases that this court is going to hear. So I think, I think we will see more of that conversation as these campaigns shift into general election mode. I think abortion access is very important. It polls people want to see some of the rights of Roe v. Wade restored, even if they're not fully on board with all aspects of it, that the images we see and from other states where abortion is much more closely restricted now, people are very disturbed by images of, women not getting care in an emergency room when, they come in and the doctor's not sure what the law allows them to do. So I think we will see Janelle Stelson and other Democrats really lean into that issue as they move into the general election, especially against someone like Scott Perry, who's such a hardliner on the other side of the issue.
Kim, last question about District 10. Scott Perry is unopposed in his primary, so he goes on to the November election. So what kind of current events have taken place lately that have influenced voters' views of Perry? If someone holds up a flashcard with Perry's name on it, what do they think of?
Well, I think they think back to the 2020 election, and they think of, he still has there's still some lingering concerns there about his role in that, and whether he was actively involved in attempts by former President Trump to overturn the results of that election. He's still fighting with the general counsel over the contents of his cell phone, what can be made public, what can't. So he's very much fighting a lot of legal issues. If you look at his fundraising, he spent a lot on legal bills. So that's an issue that I think a lot of, especially Democrats, think of when they think of Scott Perry. He's also been very vocal. He's one of the Republicans in the House who has spoken against Speaker Mike Johnson and kind of the efforts he's made to pass aid to Ukraine, for example, this massive bill that the House passed. And, you've got Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for Johnson's ouster. And, Perry has made statements, similar that, Johnson has betrayed the Republican Party and by aligning himself with Democrats, which, I think people are getting a little tired of the kind of circus in the House of Representatives, quite frankly, that, they have a speaker that's of their party, and now they're already talking about ousting him less than a year into his tenure after the whole debacle with Kevin McCarthy. So I think that's another thing that Scott Perry has aligned himself closely to recently that might be something that Republican voters, it'll see where their limits are. I think that these are issues that don't help people in PA 10 specifically necessarily. So, for a Republican to align themselves with what's going on in the House is tricky. There's a lot going on there that people are kind of turned off by and find a little bit much. They're a little tired of the theatrics, I think. And the more he sort of aligns himself with those aspects of the Republican Party, I don't think that helps him in PA 10, I think, or, if frankly, any Republican running for re-election this year. So I think they're going to be walking a fine line. It'll be interesting to see, he's formerly head of the Freedom Caucus in the House. So, he's got that baggage as well. That's the caucus is seen as being really holding up a lot of legislation and not letting Republicans kind of realize their agenda in the House because they're very hard line on so many issues. So I think he's got some baggage coming into this, and I don't know that he's done a lot to distance himself from these issues that people associate him with right now.
Carter, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to turn back to you about a headline that appeared recently, and it read, Pennsylvania's redesigned mail-in ballot envelopes trip up many voters who left the date incomplete. So, what changes were made to the ballot that has led to a new generation of mistakes?
Yeah, well, in the fall, the Shapiro administration redesigned the mail-in ballot return envelope, trying to reduce some of the errors that we've seen in recent years. Pennsylvania law, we won't get into court cases because it keeps going back and forth, but right now currently requires, well, the law requires, but the court cases differ on it, but that you have to date and sign your ballot when you return it. But a lot of voters don't do that for whatever reason, or write a wrong date on it, like their birth date or the date they registered. So the Shapiro administration redesigned the ballot.
Now, the updated ballot has the first 2 digits of the date. They're already pre-printed,
Right.
so it's up to the voter to fill in those latter 2 digits, and some aren't doing it.
Right, yeah, a lot were leaving it off. I heard from counties that this made up a significant portion of the number of ballots that are at risk of being rejected, and some counties decided that didn't constitute an improper date, and some did. So again, we have a difference here in what counties are counting which ballots.
And is the figure going to become apparent to us anytime soon? How many mail-in ballots have serious problems? And just as importantly, what counties are going to do with these ballots?
Yeah,
I understand each county has some degree of autonomy here, even though they're getting advice from the Department of State on how to handle those.
Right, yeah, the Department of State took the position that it's not a improperly dated ballot, and some counties have also taken that position. Best I can tell from the 10 or so counties I've called so far, it's mostly evenly split, but it's unclear right now exactly how many ballots that's going to account for and exactly which counties are and aren't counting them. But I think this is something we're going to see them talk about more as we get closer to November.
All right, our guests have been Kim Lyons from the PA Capital Star, Carter Walker from Votebeat, and Katie Meyer from Spotlight PA. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So much.
That's it for Journalists Roundtable this week. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.